Hello, Tansei. Welcome back to Spirit School. Danielle here. If you're new, Danielle Sarank. That's how you say my last name. It's quite tricky. And this is the story about how I became a medium because of Sylvia Browne. I love wearing this t-shirt. I will reference where I got this from and the account that really brought Sylvia Browne back up into my awareness a couple years ago during the pandemic. And in truth, I always get questions from people, whether they're students or friends, about the lineage of mediumship I come from. I call myself a spiritual medium, though I'm not a spiritualist. I am somebody who has decided to have my own personal spirituality and not align with any organization or religion. But I have clearly been influenced on my path through certain teachers and mediums who have inspired me. If you ever attend a class with me in any kind of developmental space, I'm always referencing where my teachings come from. I name the teachers, their quotes. I always think it's important to honor the lineage of where you learn things from. And that's really what was exemplified to me as I was developing. And I developed under a lot of different types of mediums. Spiritualists, absolutely. That's where my core development really comes from. 2013, I started developing, and my teacher was a spiritualist and developed under spiritualism. So that's where a lot of my foundation is, but I didn't love the culture within it. So I just decided to take my own path when it comes to mediumship development and often let spirit be my guide. I've sat one-on-one with people. I've hired different mediums of the past. I'm thinking, for example, at a time of my development, full-time established professional medium by this time, didn't necessarily need help with my mediumship or the development side, but I was also experiencing grief for my first time. And it was really hard for me to connect mediumistically with such a broken heart. And so I hired a seasoned mentor to sit with me during this time and learn how to be a medium with a broken heart that just didn't seem to be repairing. So I've hired different mentors and teachers over the past for very specific reasons. There's one teacher who doesn't want to be named because they're on a different path right now, but she was the one who really taught me everything about mediumship. I became a professional under her. I studied under her for 4 years. The ethics I have, the reverence for the spirit world, the humility I tend to come with is definitely from her. And I feel like that's where it deserves the most credit for my lineage, but I have been influenced by so many mediums of the past. And like I say, I name them all in my classes, especially if I'm speaking one of their teachings that have come through me. And in truth, I've been really focused on developing my own teachings and looking at it not just from an evidential lens, but also in balance with wisdom, more holistic indigenous perspective when it comes to spiritual communication, which reconnecting to my own culture has been a huge part of understanding my own personal spirituality and the spirit world in a lot of ways, and what it means to be a communicator on behalf of the world of spirit. I would say overall, you will often hear me reference Caroline Myss, who, when it comes to spiritual teachers, not even connected with mediumship, I've never really resonated with a lot of different spiritual books or spiritual teachers. I've read many of them, but it was really the anatomy of spirit and advanced energy that cracked open a way of teaching, lecturing, philosophy, looking at the world through archetypal lenses, what's personal versus what's archetypal. And it's helped me see mediumship in really deep layers. And so because I've looked at mediumship in really deep personal layers through much of the work of Caroline Myss, I'm able to teach it and present it in a way that is said to be digestible and also holistic. We look at the medium and the spirit world and the sitter, trauma-aware care. So I would say that my biggest influence in my mediumship was, in fact, Caroline Myss and her work. And I often bring her through in my teachings because I am so influenced by her. So that's a little bit of my lineage there, but we have to go back decades here when it comes to me actually becoming part of the mediumship development path and the mediumship path. And this goes back to the 90s. When I was in high school, I would come home, latchkey kid. First thing I would put on is Oprah. I think I've seen every episode of Oprah out there. I almost joined Scientology when I was a kid because of an episode of Oprah that I saw. So very influenced by talk shows. I love Phil Donahue and Sally Jessy Raphael and Ricky Lake and, of course, Montel Williams. And I really loved Montel Williams. I was really obsessed with Tupac at the time, and for some reason he reminded me of Tupac as well. And I really loved his charisma. He wore a black diamond bracelet that always captured my eye on the show, and I'm still working towards a black diamond bracelet myself because I've always been drawn to it. And he would have Sylvia Browne on his TV show at the time I started watching it every single Wednesday. And the truth is, I didn't grow up in a house that was overly spiritual. There was always, I never remember a time of skepticism. I always remember lights coming up in our pictures, and we would hear footsteps collectively that led to nowhere. We would have what we would call paranormal experiences. And I think that there was always like an interest from the family or an acceptance of my family, but we weren't spiritual or religious. Growing up, my biggest concern was always alien abduction. We were a complete sci-fi household too, watching all these sci-fi movies. So when Sylvia Browne came into my awareness as a teenager, me and my parents would sit and watch it together. We would record it on VHS and press play, and I feel like they must have experienced what I experienced at that time, which was awe. The fact that somebody could do this, to me, was probably one of the most profound awe things that I experienced as a youth. It sticks out so strong to me. And I would watch it every single Wednesday. And she had long nails, and she would wear bright colors, and she was always eccentric, right? Almost like what you would picture a psychic to be. This was the archetype, if you would. And she was always so quick. And the truth is, as I watched her and admired that people could do this, I didn't question anything. I often say Sylvia Browne was my theology growing up because I didn't have any theology. Though I've always been drawn to churches and Bibles and community, and I had experiences with church as a kid. We were not part of any organized religion. I had no theology. And she really was my theology, this spirit communication. The truth of the matter is, I was most interested at this time in the ghost stories. This was also a time where the TV show Most Haunted came out, and the psychic medium on that show was Derek Acora, who passed actually, I think, around the same time as Sylvia Browne, if I'm not recalling that incorrectly. And so we had Derek Acora, who was very dramatic. He would scream and yell, "Get this off of me." In fact, when I got my passport for the first time, the first place I went was Chillingham Castle, which was the first episode of Most Haunted. And I was so drawn to this type of stuff. I became aware of Sylvia Browne's books around this time as well. Sorry to digress so far from Most Haunted back here. This all was happening at the same time. I started reading some of her books, and she had stories repeated through much of these books because there was over 40 of them. And I remember the Sunnyvale Toys R Us stories of a child in spirit at Sunnyvale Toys R Us. So I was like, I need to get to Sunnyvale, California. Still never been there. I've been to California many times. She also had stories about the Sarah Winchester house, which might also be in California, but that was a place I really wanted to go and visit too. So the early spiritual awakening for me, especially when it came to Sylvia Browne, was really centered around paranormal and ghosts. I did end up going to Chillingham Castle. I have a podcast on that a couple years ago about my night there and what we did find. I also joined a group in Vancouver called Vancouver Paranormal, where we would go to, yes, some historical sites, but we would spend mostly in private residential homes with claims of persistent paranormal activity. And there was a group of 5 or 6 of us. And funny enough, like what I did for that group was EVP recording, electric voice phenomenon. So I had a really great like Sony recorder at the time. This was well before iPhones. And I would just follow the medium around, and I would be capturing. His name was Raj, and his dad was also a medium. And my job was to follow him around, record, see what we could pick up, look over the tapes after, try to validate some of the things that the medium picked up, which I also find interesting on my path as well. And so Sylvia really initiated all of this with her books and her TV show appearances. And I repeat, I never questioned any of it. I just took it as truth. Like, she must know, she has the channel. At the same time, John Edwards was also on TV, and I would watch that all the time as well. And though I much also respected his work, I'm not sure why Sylvia just always stuck with me a little bit more. Again, it could have been her flamboyance, her charisma, I do even unhinged. Like, in comparison, if you were to watch them side to side, even on that time, like, Sylvia was really unhinged. And if you think about TV in the 90s, it was really unhinged. I'm thinking of like The Swan, I'm thinking of America's Next Top Model, I'm thinking that might have been early 2000s, but like really around this time, it was really like the most sensational, the most activating. No language around safe spaces or trauma aware care. It was just basically needing shock value, right? And Sylvia really developed that shock value. There were some experiences I had with some of Sylvia books, not just the paranormal, that were really transformative for me. There was a time in my late teens, I was living with a partner that was like not very good for me, not healthy for me. And I just so happened to come across her book at the time, The Other Side and Back. And that book was like a collection of all her philosophies, like covered ghosts and angels and all sorts of different things, whereas all her other books were very specific to different topics. This was like a good book to read if you want to get a sense of everything that she taught. And there was a letter to the universe exercise in that book where she claimed you could write this letter to the universe and the universe would listen. And at the time, I was like really struggling with some grief and pain over a rupture that happened in my life. And so I wrote this letter to the universe that night. And just after I wrote it, I went to go tuck it somewhere really private. And at the time I was tucking this thing, all the lights went off in my house at the exact same time. The computer went off, all the power went off. And the truth is, after that experience, something shifted internally. I don't even think I can name it today, what it was. And we're talking, I'm 43 now. I developed enough courage to leave this relationship and became a paranormal investigator. So her books were really impactful for me. And she also had this like harshness about heaven and hell, or not heaven and hell. She used to always say hell was earth, which I thought was really kind of scary. Are we in the bad place? You would still question that in 2026, wouldn't you? But the truth is, she had these really like polarizing extreme views. And I was also in this polarizing extreme experience in my life and time in my life. And I wondered what happened to bad people when they died. I didn't know if I really believed in hell. Again, no theology other than what Sylvia said. And Sylvia said, hell is earth. I'm a humanitarian. I love humans. I love being human. I love earth. So it was always really hard for me. But this really started my journey with buying my own readings. At 18, 19 years old, I was making $22,000 a year working full time at this time. And I would still buy $200 readings in 1998, 2000. And every reader I went and saw between the ages of 17, 18, all the way up until 31, when I eventually entered the development path, had said I was a medium. And I denied it. No, not spiritual. I remember when I finally stepped on the path, I said to my eventual teacher, and she was like, you know, you're a medium and I'm going to get readings by you one day. And I remember saying, the spirit world is not going to speak through me, because I felt like I had done so much bad in my life. But it was actually through grief and loss and the death of somebody somewhat close to me that made me wonder what happens to someone like this when they die. Because I'll be honest with you, like Sylvia had some really dark teachings around what happened to people who crossed over through crossing themselves over. Trying to be as trauma aware as possible with my language here. And again, that polarization just left me in a world of questions. So I started getting readings by mediums. And again, I never questioned the mediums. I believed everything that she said and everything the mediums would say. And I had some really great experiences. Moving forward quite a bit in my timeline to 2013, I have my first child. I have some space in my life. In Canada, you get a year maternity leave. I get a reading with my eventual teacher. And it was the best reading I've ever had. Even still to this day, it's the best reading I've ever had in my life. And I started developing my mediumship. This was the first teacher I believed. I said, you know what? I was so convinced I wasn't a medium that I signed up for her psychic development course, her intuition development course, instead of her mediumship course. That's how convinced I wasn't. But I ended up having a mediumship experience in that first class, and she moved me over. And I started developing my mediumship at that time. So I had to work through a lot of confidence, a lot of solar plexus, a lot of self-esteem, and really healing what I had said to her, like the spirit world's not going to speak through me because of my, what I thought were impurities and poor life decisions and consequences that I had to face because of them. So I start connecting with spirit, and I'm building up my own faith in myself and the spirit world and what it means to be spiritual outside of religion. And I started connecting with people who cross themselves over. And what I experienced of the energies, they were in the same place as my grandma, and no different than the father that just came through really lovingly. So that was the first time I really started to question what I had been consuming as like a teen and as a young adult from Sylvia. And I started to like question, like maybe she didn't know everything. And early in my development, I was really lucky to find Caroline Mace. And it was just through a simple search, but whatever is drawn to you is for a reason. But I loved the word spirit. Like my tattoo, it's the first tattoo I got, spirit. It's my favorite word. It feels like music coming out of my mouth and out of my heart. I just love the word spirit. So I was Googling the word spirit, and I came across the anatomy of spirit. So I would go to sleep like listening to the book, and I didn't understand any of it. It took me actually about 7 years of my spiritual journey to re-listen to it and understand what she was saying. But I think that voice was really like balancing spiritual curiosities and spiritual maturity, and not seeing the spiritual quest as being outside of yourself, which mediumship really does a lot of. It's what does spirit say? What evidence can you bring through? Some training spaces I've been in have not made it personal enough for me, right? I think in Indigenous worldview, we love relational approaches to things, and that's what was really lacking in the space that I personally found. And so a lot of this teachings was about like more relational approaches or personal approaches around development. So that kind of helped balance a lot of that, but I really started to question it. So we come into pandemic days, and I'm going to try to put this video, I don't quite know how to edit quite yet. I'm learning how to edit, and I want to try to put an overlay of this video that came across my Instagram feed, and it was a clip of Sylvia Browne on Montel, and I hadn't seen a clip since probably 2005, so I'll try to put that in.
My mom passed away 3 years ago, and
she was a beautiful woman, by the way.
Thank you.
She was very flamboyant.
Yes, she was.
Yeah, she was sort of a gypsy type of woman.
Yes.
Yes.
And before she passed away, she tried several times to tell me something in the hospital, and I could not understand because of the tube she had in her mouth. And
yeah, the trachea, all that.
And I just didn't understand it. Until this day, it still bothers me that I couldn't understand my own mother.
She didn't, you know, this is really hard to tell you. Your father is not your father.
Wow.
But who cares? You love who you love.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay.
But she wanted to get that off her chest. Who cares? You know, but I mean, that was her thing.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. Okay.
Yeah, that was my face. That was my face when I first saw this. I was shocked. I laughed. I all of a sudden got all this like nostalgia, and I started thinking about all the unpacking I had been doing as well. Of course, as somebody who teaches ethics and compassionate space holding, like how do you fix this? Like how do you reconcile this? I can only imagine how that woman left that day, and I just wonder like how this weighed on her. Admittedly, it made me laugh as well because it was so unhinged. I think that's actually on the actual description of the video, is unhinged. And the truth is, I followed quite a few accounts that unpack 90s TV shows like Seventh Heaven, Biggest Loser, The Swan, and all these shows were a little bit like that. But this was the first video that came across my feed since I was a kid that I had seen. And obviously in today's context, I saw it a lot differently. I'm curious if this has come across your feed as well and what your reaction was. But yeah, it was the start of my kind of reconnecting to Sylvia wisdoms. And I followed this Instagram page. I'll tag it below because you should watch it. If you're wondering where I got my shirt from, it's from him, but he's not selling them right now. I just actually asked him today as I was preparing to record this. Oh, do you have the t-shirts for sale? But they will be for sale later this year, and I will let you know when those are available. And so I really loved this guy's page where he was just showing like old Sylvia clips, and they were absolutely unhinged. I always experienced these clips that were being facetious, but also highlighting some of the problematic things that came up. And I was not aware of any of the problematic things that were happening. I was really young, again, not fully understanding what I was witnessing. But looking back, there was like a lot of problematic things in the context and language that we have today, most definitely, especially around delivering sensitive information in a way that doesn't re-traumatize or minimizes impact of re-traumatization. There wasn't a lot of that consideration back then, which we have now. And in truth, I look at it from a balance of I wouldn't be a medium here today if it wasn't for her. And there wasn't a lot of examples for her to follow. You know, I imagine being really one of the first mediums to receive this type of spotlight, this type of exposure, and really being balanced, like with your ego, would have been hard. I feel like maybe sometimes the pressure and expectation can overtake the clear connection that is needed to do this type of work. So there was a lot of inaccuracies documented with her, and a lot that were life-altering for people, of course. So I balance that critique with also honoring the trailblazer that she was, and the fact that I can go into any classroom that I teach and ask people who here used to watch Sylvia Browne on Montel as a kid, and more than half of the hands in the Zoom room raise. So I know that she really awakened and influenced a lot of us mediums for good and bad in this day and age, but she really did put mediumship on a level of exposure that I think that a lot of people hire mediums, and mediums do quite well in this space because of that exposure, as opposed to something like Reiki or human design, which hasn't been platformed at that level yet. Mediumship has more of an easy accessibility for people because it has been on TV and because it continues to be on TV. I also think some of the TV shows are very edited, and I know this just firsthand as well because of you only get 22 minutes, but mediumship is presented as a highlight reel as well. And so some people might have unrealistic expectations on what an hour looks and sounds like compared to a 5-minute highlight reel on TV. I did an advanced mediumship program a couple years ago, and one of the assignments for my advanced medium was to take one of their readings and create a 5-minute highlight reel. And one of our students picked her worst reading and created a highlight reel, and it ended up being like phenomenal. So there's a lot to be said about mediumship and TV. I love it. It's how I became a medium because of the exposure that it has. Mad respect to Sylvia for being that trailblazer. Also really looking at it with a critical lens of today and finding just different information that happened around that time. I feel pretty measured and balanced in how I see her today. I don't feel like an emotional charge behind anything, but I definitely wanted to honor her place in my history. And I'm really curious about you. I'm curious about if you've ever had an experience with her. I remember me and my dad in maybe 2000. I was really young, around grad. Me and my dad spent hundreds of dollars each going to see her live. And we were in a venue with 10,000 people, and the readings were done on a lottery system. So it was like a bingo, like a big bingo thing, and all of our ticket numbers were in there. And basically it was chance that you would be able to get a connection. But it was interesting because she mentioned this, and I'll never forget this either, where we noticed that everyone who ended up at the mic had really deep loss. And she had mentioned there, and I was so young, I was like 17, and I'll never forget this. She said, do you notice, like, even though this is a lotto, it's only people who need to talk to me are up here? And that made me think about divinity. Is everything by chance? So despite all the things that were happening that I wasn't aware of at the time, it takes you down a path of spiritual curiosity, which is how I live my life. I've literally set up my life, my career, everything around being able to follow spiritual points of intrigue. And I feel very lucky for that. So thank you, Sylvia. Thank you. So I'm curious if you've ever had an experience. I'm also looking to hear from people who have had positive readings with her, because the truth is, I haven't been able to find anyone or any example of really positive reading experience with her. I wonder if there are people out there, and I would love to hear from you if so. So please leave a comment or email me through my website. I would love to hear from you, get your story, maybe share your story, balance things, because I'm also coming into this episode trying to be as balanced as possible about what's out there, and also honor my lineage again, like I say. So these are my Sylvia stories. I'm curious if you have any as well, or if she's been an influence for you. I've thought about pulling back out The Other Side and Back. It's out of print right now, so I can't seem to get my hands on a copy, but I would love to reread it as a medium 13 years in. There's definitely things I experienced. I'm like, oh, I remember her saying, and it didn't quite happen like that. Recently, during the pandemic, you want to talk about predictions, and you can go look this up. But during the pandemic, somebody pulled out a prediction from her 2000 predictions book and very accurately predicted the pandemic. It says in the year 2020, a respiratory infection will create a pandemic. People were like, what? This lady knew. And so the clips that I was talking about that I put into this episode, I hope I was able to put it in, are around the same time. All of this was happening at the same time. So I think a lot of us are talking about her right now. So I want to hear from you. I want to hear from you. Predictions. Do you remember any that came true? Stories, clips. I'm just curious if you have a similar path, because I can't tell you how often I meet people who had a very similar path to me. Awareness to mediumship, came out through Sylvia Browne, followed your own curiosity, ended up on your own path. I'm just curious if she's also part of your origin story, and just to have a little bit of fun on the podcast today. So no poem for you today, unfortunately. I couldn't find one that was in resonance with what we're talking about, but I will be back next week with other things that are on my heart and mind. Thank you for listening. Thank you for commenting. Thank you for following. Lots more to come, and I'll see you next time.